I always thought I had time. Not in a reckless way. Not with arrogance. It was quieter than that, a calm assumption running in the background of every decision I made. Later. I didn't rush because I didn't need to. I didn't choose because postponing felt harmless. Every important thing in my life was placed gently into the future, like an item stored carefully on a high shelf. I told myself I was being patient, strategic, mature. In reality, I was afraid of committing to a version of myself that couldn't be undone. Whenever life asked me a serious question, I answered with delay. What do you really want later? When will you take the risk later? Who do you want to become? I'll figure it out later. People admired my calm. They said I was grounded, thoughtful, not impulsive. I let them believe that. It was easier than admitting the truth that I didn't trust myself enough to choose. I believed that time was neutral. That it waited. That it belonged to me. It doesn't. Years passed without resistance. Smoothly. Comfortably. Nothing collapsed. Nothing forced my hand. I built a life that functioned well enough without demanding clarity. Responsibilities filled the space where intention should have been. Work. Routine. Familiar faces. Acceptable days. I wasn't unhappy. That's what made it dangerous. Unhappiness would have demanded action. Comfort allowed postponement. I told myself I would do the meaningful things when conditions were right. When I felt ready. When I knew more. When the fear faded. But fear doesn't fade when you avoid it. It just becomes part of your structure. I noticed small signs I ignored. How often I felt restless without knowing why. How achievements felt hollow the moment after they were reached. How I avoided thinking too far ahead because the future felt strangely blank. When people talked about passion, direction, purpose, I listened politely, like someone overhearing a conversation in a language they used to understand. At night, lying in bed, I sometimes imagined a different life. Not a fantasy, just a divergence. A version of me who had chosen earlier. Who had failed faster. Who had lived messy, louder, more honestly. Those thoughts were painful, so I treated them as distractions. Not now. Later. The moment that changed everything wasn't dramatic. No illness. No accident. No sudden loss. It was a simple realization that arrived quietly, almost politely, and refused to leave. I was older than I remembered being. Not old, just past certain thresholds I hadn't noticed crossing. I looked at my life and saw how many decisions had been made by default. How many paths had closed not because I chose differently but because I waited until choosing was no longer possible. Opportunities don't announce their expiration dates. They just stop appearing. That was when panic finally arrived, not loud, not chaotic but heavy. Like a weight settling into my chest, I understood something I had avoided for years. By always choosing later, I had already made my choice. And time had accepted it on my behalf. After that realization, time stopped feeling abstract. It became personal. I started noticing it everywhere, not in clocks, but in people. In how conversations changed. In how certain invitations stopped coming. In how silence settled more easily where possibilities used to live. Time wasn't rushing. It was closing doors quietly behind me. I tried to do what I always did when discomfort appeared, delay it. Distract myself. Convince myself that awareness alone was progress. That understanding the problem was somehow equivalent to solving it. It wasn't. The awareness only sharpened the pain. I began replaying moments I had treated as temporary, not realizing they were final. Chances I assumed would repeat. People I thought would always be there in the same way. Versions of myself I believed I could return to whenever I felt ready. You don't notice the last time something happens while it's happening. That truth haunted me. I remembered conversations where I had said, not now. Projects I had postponed until I felt more confident. Relationships I kept comfortable instead of honest. None of those decisions felt wrong at the time. That's what made them lethal. Regret didn't arrive as sorrow. It arrived as inventory. I counted years the way people count money after realizing they've been careless with it. I measured my life in deferrals. In intentions that never became actions. In plans that were always almost ready. I asked myself a question that terrified me: if I had to live this exact life again, would I choose it? I didn't answer immediately. I wanted to be fair. I wanted to acknowledge the stability, the safety, the lack of catastrophe. I wanted to appreciate the absence of chaos. But the longer I sat with the question, the clearer the answer became. No. That realization felt like betrayal, not of my past, but of my future. I had been preserving myself for a moment that never arrived. Waiting to feel certain. Waiting to feel worthy. Waiting to feel brave. Waiting for permission that no one was going to give. The fear beneath all of it finally surfaced: what if I choose now and it's too late? That fear paralyzed me more than uncertainty ever had. Because choosing late means choosing with consequences you can't erase. It means accepting that some outcomes are no longer available. That some versions of happiness are time sensitive. I began to understand that my mental breakdown wasn't dramatic because it didn't need to be. The damage was already done quietly. All that remained was acknowledgement. I felt grief for the first time, real grief, not for something that had happened, but for something that never would. For the life that required earlier courage. For the risks that demanded a younger version of me. For the person I might have been if I hadn't mistaken patience for wisdom. That grief didn't push me to action immediately. It pushed me into stillness. I sat with it. Let it breathe. Let it accuse me without interruption. And somewhere inside that heaviness, another realization formed, slower, steadier, and harder to ignore. Time hadn't taken everything. Not yet. But whatever I did next would be smaller, heavier, and more honest than anything I had imagined before. Because choosing now wouldn't be about becoming someone new. It would be about accepting what I had already lost and deciding whether the remaining time would also be spent waiting. The final choice didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an ending. Not of my life, but of my illusion that I could still have all versions of it. I stopped asking what I could become and started asking what I was willing to live without. That shift changed everything. It stripped the fantasy out of the future and replaced it with something far less comfortable: limits. Choosing late means choosing within boundaries. Some doors stay closed no matter how sincerely you knock. Some timelines don't restart just because you finally show up. Accepting that hurt more than regret ever had. But inside that pain, something unexpected emerged: honesty. I stopped chasing the idea of redemption. I stopped trying to catch up to who I thought I should have been. I let go of the need to make my life impressive enough to justify the years I had postponed. Instead, I focused on what was still possible: not grand, not dramatic, but real. I began making decisions without waiting for confidence to arrive. Confidence, I learned, is usually the reward, not the requirement. I chose imperfectly. Slowly. With full awareness of what could no longer be undone. And for the first time, I didn't lie to myself about the cost. Some dreams stayed dreams. Some paths remained unexplored. Some versions of happiness existed only as memory or imagination. I let them go. Not with peace but with respect. Because holding on to what can't be reclaimed only steals from what remains. The strangest part was this: once I stopped waiting, time felt different. Not kinder, just clearer. Days regained weight. Moments mattered again, not because they were abundant, but because they were finite. I became more present. Less distracted by what might have been. More attentive to what was. The emptiness that once haunted me didn't vanish, it transformed. It became a quiet companion rather than an accusation. A reminder of the life I chose not to live and the one I was choosing now. If you're listening to this and still telling yourself later, understand this, later is not a promise. It's a habit. A habit that feels harmless until it owns your future. You don't need to panic. You don't need to overhaul everything overnight. But you do need to choose consciously before time does it for you. I kept saying later. Until there was no time left. What I have now isn't the life I once imagined. But it's honest, and after everything, honesty feels like the only form of freedom still available.